Hello and welcome to Team English Talks, our first podcast of 2025. A very happy new year to you and a very happy new year to Miss Owens and Ms Weston, who are currently sat with me, joined for our first podcast of the year. Happy New Year indeed. And we are talking about place poetry this week. Now, I've introduced the podcast this week because Miss Owens is currently dozing in the corner and she was worried that she wouldn't know what to say. But there is nothing more exciting, Miss Owens, is there, than delving into some place poetry?
There actually isn't, and not just because I've been marking Year 11 poetry, not necessarily to do with place, but some of the poems that have come up here. So I feel like I should know my stuff by now. However, having had sort of 3 weeks of napping in the afternoon, it's a bit of a shock to the system to be back and actually talking. And
could have got some good place poetry out of the snow outside of my window up in Thornton. Felt like Wordsworth. I did.
Oh, it was wonderful, wasn't it?
I think I probably could have said something nice about the sludge that accumulated on my very busy road.
So shall we talk a little bit about the poems that we're going to talk about and sort of why we've picked those ones, and then sort of the good links. So we sort of decided to go into 4 main ones, didn't we? Ones that we felt were
most placey.
Yes. So do you want to tell us about those, Miss Owens?
Yep, so we've got London because London is a place. There we go.
Analysis over. Next poem.
And it's quite a good one in terms of sort of representation of place and power. And
I think it's got a lot going on as well as place that you can get your teeth into.
Yeah, it's quite a nice one to look at, and there has been a question on London and place before as well. So
it's a classic.
Would be a classic one. Living space as well, because living space is a place. There you are. That's our poem. Tick. There we go. It rhymes.
It does.
Yeah, it rhymes. And again, it's quite a nice one to sort of maybe contrast with London, because you get that sort of like criticism of the place, but also that hope at the end of it, which you don't get with London.
No.
And then I would say the soldier.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's that love of place, that sort of patriotism, and again, like the other two, you get a very sort of sense, a sort of. It's very hopeful, but the whole idea of it is, if I should die, kind of undermines the entire sense of hope. Yeah. And it's that idea of clinging to that sense of place that gives him a reason for being.
And I think the title of the poem, The Soldier, would make you think it's a war poem. I mean, I suppose in some ways it is, but I think at its heart, it is a place poem.
That's the good thing about so many of these poems, is that, they do hit so many themes, so it is worth delving into them quite a lot, and that comes under the next one as well, doesn't it, Miss Owens, about it being an all-rounder.
Yeah, Ozymandias as well. Again, how you can use place to sort of comment on or critique power and the result of that power, the use of that power, and whether it lasts or not.
I think as well the last 2 poems, Soldier and Ozymandias, we think about nature as well, how nature is portrayed as kind of in one quite peaceful and beautiful and gentle, and the other as something powerful. In Ozymandias, it's a kind of a power of nature over, a place over humans.
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll probably talk about that when we do them, in that idea of, when you attack the question of place, being able to talk about how nature, or even compare how nature is present within the place and how nature affects the place, is very useful when it comes to writing about place, definitely. And then, as usual, we're going to do the sort of tack on to the end, aren't we, and talk about the other ones that you could also talk about, otherwise known as the ones that we don't really like and don't want to talk about.
But why would you, when you've got 4 banging poems that you can talk about place? Unless I can't see any of the other ones being a named poem about place. But
it would be very unusual. I think.
It'd be unusual,
there are others, I think, other than the ones we picked out that might come and you might talk about place with, but not a named poem, certainly not.
Yeah. So should we get on to London then?
Yeah, let's do some London.
It's quite nice because we were talking about nature before, and even though there's not much nature in London, certainly not at the time that Blake was writing. It was sort of industrial revolution, post-industrial revolution, if I'm right, Miss Weston.
It is, yeah.
Along with the resident historian in the room. But we get that sort of sense of nature been like the Thames.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the lack of nature itself is a comment on nature.
Yeah.
Because the only thing, like you said, is the Thames.
Yeah.
And even that's chartered.
Yeah, it's almost like nature has become a bit of a commodity there, hasn't it? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's been taken over by the government and sort of claimed, whereas that's obviously not what the Romantics were all about when it comes to writing about nature and things like that.
Yeah, you've got that contrast from sort of Wordsworth talking about sort of daffodils and wandering lonely as a cloud, and then you've got here, I wander through the chartered, each chartered street. Each one is mapped out, it's controlled, it's it's designated, and there's some kind of almost sort of conflict there in the sense that nature shouldn't be controlled.
Well, I think within the line itself there is that internal contradiction of chartered and flow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Flow suggests this freedom, whereas chartered suggests this control and
that sort of freedom despite the attempt to control it, perhaps.
Or the attempt to control something that should be free and yet it is confined.
And I think that sets up how Blake is going to attack the place in the poem, isn't it? This almost immediate criticism of or he gets across his feelings of criticism about the place through his comment on nature there, I think. And just London is incredibly miserable in this poem, isn't it? Just so
there's nothing redeeming about it.
No, there is no hope injected into this poem at all, is there? It's just everyone is suffering under the...
I mean, I suppose in some areas of London, maybe not so much nowadays, but you did get that sense of helplessness, that haplessness, or hapless nature, the sense of that lack of hope, and we get this as well. We mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe, that sort of sense that people have been repressed, that they've been ground down by the place. I'm not going to make a joke about how that might sound familiar.
And I think as well it's that use of man and infant is, it's from the cradle to the grave.
Yeah, you are oppressed by this place.
And I think that ties in nicely with some of Blake's ideas about childhood and probably some of the things he was seeing at the time, which are also mentioned in the poem, like the chimney sweepers. He lived in a time where he would have seen very young children, not having what we would think of as childhood of like running free. It's certainly not what Blake thought of childhood. This idea of them having no freedom, being forced to work in dirty, dangerous conditions, and there is just no escape.
Yeah, like the infant's cry of fear as well. It's that idea that the infants, particularly to sort of the Romantics as well, being a child signified innocence, and that childlike sort of you should be curious about the world, you should be sort of excited by it, and yet from a very young age they've been taught to fear the place around them. And
I think that links really well to the Mind Forged Manacles as well, because it's always good to consider the nuance in that language, where it's like it's almost I don't know what you guys think, but almost a bit of a criticism of the citizens of London itself. Like they're trapped within their own mind, and they could do something about this, and there is that allusion later on to the revolution, but it's like, come on, a bit of a call to arms kind of thing. Like I
think there's definitely a sense of frustration on Blake's part, that he is frustrated that people seem to be accepting their servitude, accepting their kind of oppression, and I think as well, like with that idea of infant, just to go back to that, is that the Romantics were the first kind of group to come up with this idea that our personality is formed through our experiences, whereas before that it was this idea that you were just born the person you are, and that's how you just born a certain way, and that's how you are for the rest of your life, whereas the Romantics had this idea that you are formed by your experiences, which I think is much more common nowadays. We kind of buy into that. I think this idea of
nature versus nurture, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes us really think about, well, what people are being created if the experiences that these children have are of fear, or of weakness, or of blood and crying and all these things, that I think there's a certain sense of doom for the future.
And then that links intrinsically to the fact that this is from his Songs of Innocence and Experience collection, isn't it?
Yeah.
His innocence poems were about childhood, that belief of that innate innocence of childhood, and as the songs of experience start happening, you get these things that are affecting his life and stuff. I think that it's a really good contextual point to make at that point, I would say.
There's something really dystopian about this, isn't there, even though it's obviously written in the past. You can almost sort of see something of like Hunger Games or something, of people just sort of being a part of their own oppression and just
Yeah.
walking into it all in like almost like a zombie sort of effect. And you can hear that sort of frustration, but that also sort of hint of superiority as well. Like
Yeah.
I wander through the Charlotte streets and I'm seeing everybody else
Yeah.
sort of looking oppressed.
I think that's what makes this a very interesting poem to compare with Living Space, because I was having this conversation yesterday in Intervention, how you need to remember that London, Blake himself is not writing as actually someone who is experiencing the poverty and the sort of distress of being in London. He's observing it. He was a relatively wealthy man, well known, you know, and
I mean,
would
he died in poverty.
yeah,
I think he wasn't. I'm going to have to disagree with you a
yeah,
little bit there.
that's fine, Miss Weston. You go ahead, yeah.
Because I think that you are right. He's not experiencing the abject poverty, but he was not, especially compared to other romantic poets at the time like Wordsworth, and then slightly later like Byron. He was not wealthy.
Oh, right, yeah.
I think he was from London, so he'd, if anything, in his lifetime, he had seen that change of London, where he was living, being a fairly small, underpopulated place, to this kind of
watched it
boom. Yeah.
grow. Yeah.
So, I think you're right. As in, he's not experienced the kind of the kind of youthful Harlot's chimney sweeping
he's
lifestyle.
not,
The desperation.
Yeah.
But he's not.
Maybe a bit more aware of it than other people would have been.
He's not living out in a country house and coming to
enough.
visit.
Yeah. And the sort of link I was going to make there was this idea with Imtiaz Dharker as well. Like it's an observer's perspective, isn't it? In
I agree with
Living
you there,
Space, So yeah, is there anything else we want to talk about London, or
we get the clear blame as well for it, why the place has become what it is, but also places such as the church, the palace, these symbols of oppression, which actually should be, the church should be looking after its people, and yet.
Should we address, just in case anyone is Googling London, and we're not even going to address just to tell them that they shouldn't talk about it?
Don't talk about this. This is coming from me and Mr Steele as
our experience as examiners.
We're examiners, so we marked quite a lot of
what
poetry.
I can't even remember what the phrase is.
So it's if you go down acrostically.
Oh, I wasn't even meaning that.
Oh, no.
Oh, right, okay, never mind then. Just don't talk about this either, then I'll let Mr Steele.
I don't know why I brought this up.
Down acrostically on the third stanza, it spells out here.
Yeah, and that's an irrelevant point. You're not going to.
And it's almost like but it doesn't work because nothing else is acrostic.
Yeah.
What was the phrase that people kept using about the comment on the government, the church, and the
Trinity.
Yeah, Trinity of evil or something like that, wasn't it?
That either.
No.
You may see that when you do some like Googling and revision and stuff like that. For this exam board, you do not need to talk about anything like that, and the examiner is not impressed by it. So there's no need to even go into
And
that.
we know the examiner's not impressed because we're examiners and we're not
We're
impressed.
not impressed by
It
it.
doesn't really do anything, does
No.
it? It's just one of those things that people think if they put it in, it'll sound
Yeah, because the mark scheme
clever.
is telling you to engage with the language that is being used, not blast off all these things that you've apparently heard about.
Yeah. And I think it's enough to talk about, just as Miss Owens said, the idea of these are institutions that are causing it, and they should be institutions that are helping their people.
And it brings that idea about the French Revolution as well.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
obviously this is something that we need to talk about context with.
Yeah.
And that idea of sort of rebelling against those establishments that are causing this repression, that are...
Make it run in blood down the palace walls.
Yeah, that idea of accountability as well.
But still, that it's an illusion. It's not that outright call to arms, isn't it? Because he's almost afraid of...
And if anything, this could be a sort of reflection of the time that this poem was written, where the French Revolution had become something that it was not supposed to be. You had the terror, it's kind of off the point, but perhaps again some disappointment and frustration from William Blake that should have been this big event to free people from oppression had become in its own way an oppressive force. So I think there, going back to that, what Mr Steele said earlier about that criticism, I think this is an angry, frustrated poem, and he's angry and frustrated at a lot of things, including the people that are oppressed, because he can see their oppression, but they don't seem to be able to see it themselves.
Yeah. It's like walking around with sort of blinkers on,
Yeah, or mind-forged manacles.
Mind-forged manacles, yeah. Okay. Right. Should we move on to the soul? Oh no, should we move on to living space?
I think that
Living space is a good connector one,
good
isn't it? Yeah, and then we'll come back to the soldier.
Yeah. It's only a page away.
Yeah.
Okay with that.
Well, I think this is one of those ones that is very easy to tell the kind of place that you're dealing with just by looking at the sort of layout of it. It's very, very crooked, isn't it?
And there's not many poems that you can write about the layout in a meaningful way, but this is definitely one poem that you can.
Yeah.
And the fact that it opens up with that criticism that we've just talked about with Blake, there are just not enough straight lines. She opens up by sort of, that frustration comes from the
It's very blunt, isn't it? Like, well, this is what's going on. There's not enough straight lines. There's not enough, help to set up these slums in India.
Can we just talk a bit about the context then before we
so obviously this is Imtiaz Dharker. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that not someone who lived in poverty in the slums in India. She's not writing from experience from the slums. She Scottish Pakistani poet, born in Pakistan and moved to Glasgow at about age 4, and writes again a lot about injustice and things like that, but spends a lot of time in India, splits the time between London and Glasgow and Mumbai, and has seen and has sort of experienced in terms of going around a lot of the slums in Mumbai, and this was written in sort of as a response to, not a response to, but a sort of exploration of her, what she witnessed while she was in the slums. But this is one of those ones where I think you put it next to London, and we've talked about how there's that complete abject lack of hope in London, whereas this one does seem to inject a little bit of hope towards the end, sort of hope despite the difficulties.
And I think unlike in Living Space is unlike London, because in London there's this like we said, this sense of frustration of the people, whereas I think in Living Spaces there's almost this admiration of the people
that's the problem.
Who are making their lives in this place and keeping the sense of hope and keeping the sense of there's a real liveliness about it that you definitely don't get in London. And I think this, which could be reflective of the time it was written, the fact that Living Space is a very modern poem, that perhaps she doesn't have those slightly paternalistic views that Blake does, that she kind of has a more modern view of people as not some people that need to be helped to realise their oppression, but people that need to be appreciated in their own way.
Yeah, you've got a sense that they're doing something about their situation, they're making the best of it, and it's not the people that are just sort of being victims as such, but they are actually, there's a lot of admiration there, there's a lot of sort of that sense of the miraculous, that sense of the walls of faith, somebody's even dared to place these eggs in a wire basket. You get that sort of sense of she really does admire these people for making the most out of this living space. Yeah.
And then I think, but also that you do have this kind of undertone of threat, this nails clutch, someone has squeezed a living space, and that kind of use of someone.
Yeah, who is that someone?
Who is that someone? Yeah. Is it the person who has made their home there and they've just made it what they can do, or is it that someone has forced them into there? So it's that sense of, could it be people are being forced into these little spaces, or is it that people are just making the best of what they've got? And both, could be. And then that dark edge, there's this sense of threat, so it's almost like a constant balance, isn't it, between hope and despair.
And I think exploring those alternative interpretations is what's important to get into the sort of high grades as well, isn't it? You're not talking about the sort of
could, might,
should, perhaps, no, not perchance,
not perchance.
It's I really like this poem. It's one of my certainly I like this one better than Tissue on the AQA spec.
Much better than Tissue.
But I think I would say my favourite line in this one is that the whole structure leans dangerously. That sort of this sense of, you were just talking about threat, Miss Weston, that sense of this could go at any minute, and it doesn't necessarily mean it could be just referring to the slum itself, it could just go, but it's like this entire society, this entire system is leaning dangerously. It's unequal. It could topple at any moment. You know, I think it's a very poignant poem. I think it makes you reflect on a lot of things around the world. It's
do you think there's a sense of change there? So I've never really thought about it like that. The whole structure leans dangerously towards the miraculous. That there is a sense of there could be change, there could be hope, there could be
see where it goes.
That it could lean, and it could, you know, people could shake off the means of oppression. Whereas I think, you know, comparing to London, we have a very different outlook of what the people are able to do.
And I think then you come to that final line talking about the eggs being the bright thin walls of faith, and again it's one of those where you could talk about the faith being in the structure itself, and they've put their faith in the structure that it's going to stay standing, that they can put their eggs on the edge of it and it's not going to fall off and it's not going to, you know, destroy their food source. But also you could maybe even interpret it as Dharker herself saying, you know, the faith that she's got in these people to persevere and to maybe not rise up. I don't think it's a revolutionary poem.
No, I don't think it's a revolutionary poem, but to break out of systems of oppression.
Absolutely, there's that faith there. It's certainly not as bleak as Blake's. Bleak old Blake.
No. But I don't think it's 100% hopeful if we, you know, when we in a moment move to the soldier. I think that, you know, it has perhaps a realistic view of society, of this place. It's not romanticising it with a lowercase r.
Romanticising lowercase. Yeah, she's not a romantic poet.
She's not a romantic poet.
No.
Lovely.
I was just thinking, if it was me making my own house, I don't think I wouldn't be having scrambled eggs every day.
I would not be putting my eggs in a wire basket on a house I built. Certainly not. No.
Maybe like a tent, a sheet over some sticks or something in the garden.
I'd just wrap all my eggs in cotton wool and I'd leave them in the corner. They're not getting hung anywhere.
Mr Steele's corner eggs.
He's weird. He keeps his eggs in corner. Right, moving swiftly on. Shall we do the soldier?
I think we should, yeah.
Rupert.
Not a poem, I'm going to be honest, not a poem I massively love.
No. And I think, because we have covered this on the War Poetry podcast as well, haven't we? I think disregarding all this, not disregarding because you still can talk about it, but we all know about the patriotism and the propaganda sort of thing and stuff like that. I think the appreciation for me comes in the way he describes England. That it always gives me that image of like the, you know, stereotypical rolling green countryside hills in the Yorkshire Dales and stuff like that. Where was Rupert Brooke from?
No idea.
I think it was down south.
So probably not talk about the Yorkshire Dales, but it reminds me of the Yorkshire Dales. You know, that sort of luscious green. It's I think it does paint a beautiful picture of England at least. But what do we think?
And then we get this whole sort of idea of him using a place to be able to, again, maybe get a sense of hope, even if it's undermined by the whole idea of him being dead, that it's that clinging to that sense of place, that sense of identity, that sense of this is why I'm doing it, because the idea was, again with war, that you are protecting your place, your home that is vulnerable. It's personified as a woman because, as we know, women are vulnerable. And it's that idea that he uses it as a way of sort of being able to justify what he's about to do and to be able to face the very real possibility that he's going to die.
I think there is that kind of sense, you know, that this is someone who might be afraid and trying to think about, who is preoccupied with death and thinking about what it is for. And, you know, and as we know, he did die very early on in the war. Never saw frontline action.
No.
So perhaps, you know, I wonder if his friends and family would agree with some of the sentiments in the poem.
It would be really interesting, you know, if he'd come back afterwards. You know, England would have been a very different place post-war, and you know, whether there'd be a partner poem to this.
Whether his poetry would maybe take on a similar vein to your Wilfred Owens and your Siegfried Sassoons and things like that.
I think there's some nice kind of imagery of, like, you know, richer, that idea that this is a land that gives, you know, England bore, shaped, made aware that this is a land full of life, It's giving life, that personification of a mother. I think really kind of shows his love and appreciation, but I think it's very hard to analyse this poem without that edge of knowing when he wrote it and why he wrote it. And
almost as if like this is a poem to show to all the other soldiers going out to war, thinking, this is what you're fighting for, lads. Think about Mother England, and this beautiful place, and have this in your back of your mind as you fight,
because it does buy into a lot of those kind of propaganda images of England. Like you see the post of the green rolling hills,
isn't this worth fighting for,
and all that. It's very hard not to look at it and with a sense of cynicism, because we all know what happened. We know what happened to Rupert Brooke. We know what happened to hundreds of thousands of other young men who believed that this is what they were fighting for. And I think it's hard to take it seriously as a place. I also think it's difficult because this is not potentially an England that a lot of people would recognise,
Well, even just, blessed by sons of home, like, where's the sun?
Where's the sun? It's a very kind of, it seems almost pre-industrial. Obviously, it was not written pre-industrial, but it,
I think from a post-colonial point of view as well, there's that sort of idealism with England, that all we do or all we've ever done is bring joy and happiness and wealth and growth to all the places that we have invaded and
that idea of gentleness, which kind of goes against, this was written, Britain was at the height of his empire, and it was not a gentle thing.
And that idea carrying even in the second line, if he does die, he's done it, and England will have conquered and sort of absorbed that sort of land. And unfortunately for old Rupert, he's buried in a corner of a foreign Greek island that is still Greek. It's not English.
For me, there's a sense of like homesickness as well. Again, sort of thinking that with him he takes the values of England, but he also takes those memories of England. So again, when he's facing the unknown in a foreign field somewhere, that he's carrying that piece of England with him, that memory of the place, that idealistic memory of the place. Because let's face it, I mean, you wouldn't fight unless you had something worth fighting for. So even if perhaps maybe he is romanticising this, and perhaps it's not all the rolling hills and stuff, but in his mind that's what's keeping him going. That's what's keeping him so for example, if we were talking about fighting for Yorkshire or something, you might be thinking the Yorkshire Dales, something that's more picturesque, rather than maybe just what's on your doorstep.
You're right there, definitely.
And I just like the idea of this. Again, it's quite naive. There's a real naive sense
there's a real
to it,
naivety, and I think that that sense of place kind of shows his perhaps naivety, and it really, even though we're not talking about war, I think his description of place really places him in a time. And that this would not, I don't think a poem like this would be written nowadays.
No.
Because I don't think that we would have those kind of blindingly patriotic views of England, whereas I think that he, because of the time he was writing in, because of the circumstances he was writing in, I think his description of place is very much shaped by that, almost like England shaped him. He is shaped by the circumstances of his writing it.
And I think with London as well, both of them, the people are products of the places, aren't they? So England, Boar-shaped, made aware, whereas with London, you've got that mind-forged manacles. People are sort of tethered to that idea of a place, whether it's good or not. So I think it's always useful to be sort of looking at these, particularly, the higher bands, those more subtle comparisons.
Because it'd be very easy to just write about the soldier in London, one's positive, one's negative, but you are right, there is this sense of the place you're from shapes you as a person, and that you take a part of the place.
There's an acceptance with both of them as well. If we're saying that with London that people are just walking around and just it's what it is, that kind of thing. There's a kind of that with the soldier as well, that I'm going to war and
I might die,
whatever.
Die, and we'll just accept
it will be worth it.
There's a lack of sort of there's a massive acceptance of both of them. Really.
I think when you start to think about it, the soldier is an incredibly sad poem because you know that all of his idealism was for nothing, you know.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to read it in the positive light when you take the context, and of course in the exam context is very important, so you can discuss, you know, what this poem means in the context of him writing it.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, Ozymandias.
Right. Oh, you say Ozymandias. I say
Oh, I
Ozymandias.
switched between the two.
I'm an Ozymandias as well.
Yeah. I just think if it's a written exam,
It's a written
as long
exam.
as you
Yeah, it
get
doesn't matter,
right,
yeah.
it's all right.
So this is the one with the desert.
The one with
Analysis
the
over.
Yeah, and a big statue that's fallen
Big statue
down.
in desert. Done.
Big statue in desert. Done.
I absolutely love this poem. This is my favourite poem in the
Yes.
anthology.
It's great.
It's such a
For such a short poem, there's so much you can get into.
it's such a underhanded criticism, like that he wanted to get away with, but also just the idea that it was written just in competition with his mate, like just.
And no one remembers his mate's poem.
What's it? I think it was called Horace Smith.
Horace Smith, yeah.
Horace Smith.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think Shelley won.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you a
Shelley
single
won.
line from Horace's Ozymandias, but yeah.
And obviously, you know, written when the statue was rescued, shall we say?
Rescued. Acquired might be a word. Stolen by the British Museum. It's still there. You could go see it if you want.
I guess there's that sense of displacement as well. With the soldier, he's somewhere that he doesn't want to be. He's not at home.
Yeah.
And then you've got this statue here that's, been taken somewhere.
And also the thing, you know, Shelley's writing it as if there is this unknown statue lying in the desert, whereas actually it was very well known and it's in the middle of London.
Yeah. I always like the distance that he creates between himself and the place, and that description of the antique land, immediately it conjures these stereotypical images of this far away, sandy sort of exotic areas, but you know it has to be a traveller from the antique land because he has never been there, because he only knows about the statue because it's in the British Museum.
And I think as well this idea of, you know, that distancing as well, it kind of really underlines the fact that Ozymandias has been forgotten. He is, he's not known. He's unimportant because you would only hear about it from someone who has happened to pass by it, a traveller who's happened to walk past it.
I think when we talk about place in this one, we mentioned it earlier, this idea that it's so intrinsically linked with nature in this, because nature dominates the place and nature envelops the power of Ozymandias and completely just overtakes it completely. You've got it, even from the very start, the fact that the statue is trunkless, and it not even with the statue is the shattered visage half sunk. It's very isolated in this desert landscape, and the desert has sort of claimed it for its own, like almost started to eat.
And I think that repetition of stand in the desert on the sand, it's kind of that idea that, you know, this really is a place that has no life. There's no plants, there's no trees, there's no grass. So I think, you know, Shelley is really emphasising the fact that, like you said, this isolation, there's nothing around.
The only things that are remnant of Ozymandias' power are the passions that the sculptor knew of him, that are stamped on, and Shelley literally says these lifeless things. Like, it is in a lifeless place, there's nothing left of Ozymandias except this reputation that apparently the sculptor must have known by giving him that sneer of cold command. Like, he's only known as this cruel despot. There's nothing in this place left of his works, his
and I think using that idea
power.
Of using place to criticise power, you know, we can link that again back to London and back to living space. I think, you know, links up London quite nicely because obviously these are both romantic poets, romantic with capital R, romantic poets who are, you know, do have that disdain, are critical of power, are living in a time where people are questioning, you know, absolute monarchy, who are questioning, you know, power, you know, rights. You know, this is, you know, just after the French Revolution, just after the American Revolution, we have, you know, vindication of the rights of man, vindication of the rights of women. So that idea that they are living in a time when, and they are cleverly using place to criticise that. London has this idea of, you know, the leaders causing this terrible place, and then Ozymandias has this idea of using place to show those in power that they won't last forever.
The transience of their power.
The transience of power. Ooh, a nice phrase.
It's just, it's completely, for what? Like, you can have all your power in this place, and you can create a place like London where you have oppressed your people in there, but then go down, you know, a couple of thousand years, what's going to be there?
Remembered?
Nothing beside remains.
Yeah,
There will be nothing there.
It's really humbling, this poem, in terms of you sort of thinking about the impact that us as humans have on the landscape. You know, we trounce all over it, don't we? But then in the end, it's always going to be there. It's going to outlast us.
Yeah, that classic. Go on, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to be controversial then and talk about Mammoth's Wood.
Immediately your head into my head pop. Ooh, like Mammoth's Wood.
Yeah, because with this one we've got that sense of sort of nature sort of taking over, and it's almost as if, you know, he never existed. And with Mammoth's Wood, because obviously, you know, relatively speaking, it's very modern. You know, the war wasn't that long ago. This is almost the process of
the healing process of
nature sort of retaking its land and healing and everything. And perhaps in like 1,000 years, there's going to be no trace of World War One or World War Two.
Well, yeah, that's the classic phrase, isn't it? You know, the Earth will still be here in 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Will we? Probably not. Well, not us three old hags. We will be long gone. Our power will be long forgotten. Shattered visages and all.
Simply finding a time capsule, a copy of Team English Talks.
Oh God, can you imagine? It's World Book Day.
It's World.
But that's the thing. Like, the human race will probably not be here in 1,000 years, but the Earth absolutely will. And whatever nature looks like, it will have taken back the Earth. And that's what's happening in this place in Ozymandias. You know, he ruled over this place with an iron fist, oppressed his people, and yet 2,000 years later, gone. Nothing beside remains again. I always like, and again, this is sort of like a point linked to place, but I think with this poem, I love the paradox of, like, he's talking about how much Ozymandias has been forgotten and nothing, it's all pointless and stuff. It's like, but mate, I would be sat here around a table with two of my colleagues discussing Ozymandias or know who he was if you hadn't written this poem. So you're kind of responsible.
But that's part of Shelley's point. The reason why we remember this poem, we were talking about Ozymandias, is because Shelley wrote a poem. Yeah. And I think, you know,
not because he was powerful.
Not because he was powerful. So again, it fits into Shelley's kind of romantic ideas of art, literature, you know, creativity being more long-lasting, more important than just kind of power and oppression, and which again links to the fact that it's written as a sonnet, which even in Shelley's day was an old-fashioned form of poetry. So he's showing that you know, the powerful leaders will be forgotten, but the art and will creativity remain. And the kind of idea of, like, I guess he's saying what it means to be human. Well, power and oppression aren't what it means to be human. Creativity, that kind of thing. That's what lasts.
I suppose working alongside with nature as well, rather than oppressing it. You know,
like, has Ramesses II had any impact on my life? No. Has Ozymandias? Yes.
Very much so.
Good point. You know, it's a really good point, that, actually.
Yeah, because we're not sat around here talking about Ramesses, are we?
No, we're talking about the poem and Shelley, and a great poem it is. Well done, Percy.
Well done, Percy. Who is a man.
Yes.
I have to keep reminding myself. Is that woman? No, it's a man.
Shelley.
Shelley.
Yeah, Shelley. No, Shelley is a surname.
Right. Should we do our little sweep up?
Sweep up.
Yep.
So what are our poems on the sweep up for what you could potentially talk about place with?
Death of a Naturalist.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, set in that flax dam and, you know, exploring his love of nature through the place. And the place is described
in two different ways.
Yeah, in two very different ways, but both very sort of sensory.
Yeah.
I would say it's like the you get an experience of the place through the language used by Heaney in this one, I think.
Yeah. And I think you also get that idea of the place doesn't change, but the person does, the perspective does.
Yeah, because you have all year round the dam festered, hot day, the fields were rank, but what follows is very different, isn't it? You know,
the opinions have changed.
Yeah.
Which again links to Ozymandias in that idea of, like, in Ozymandias, the place does change and reclaims the place back, whereas in this it's like, you've got that permanence of the place, but it's the person that's changed. Definitely. What else have we got, or is there anything else we want to talk about on Death of a Naturalist?
I just think of Death of a Naturalist, I just think one big thing you really need to think about is that how the change in the perspective of place links to a change of innocence.
Yes.
Again, it's using place to explore a bigger idea, and that militaristic language, that idea that he lived through a civil war, and that's kind of contributed to his loss of innocence, as well as experiencing the death of his brother at a young age. And again, it's if you're asked about place, it can be, what does the place symbolise? It doesn't have to be, well, this place is described as nice, this place is not described as nice. It's the place is used to explore a bigger idea.
Absolutely.
And it's all to do with like the life cycle as well, isn't it? That in one place you get the entire life cycle, and while he's a child, he's probably just thinking about the the tadpoles bursting, and becoming frogs, and then by the end of it, it's all sort of tainted with a sense of death and decay and everything, but all in the same place.
And then Wife in London.
Yeah, I suggested this one to Miss Owens, in that I think this one always reminds me of, and obviously don't quote me verbatim on this in your exams because it's not the point, but always reminds me of those like smoky like film noirs from the 40s when he first describes that first stanza where he describes the place. It's so evocative, you can literally picture it. She sits in the tawny vapour that the city lanes have uprolled, the webby fold on fold, that street lamp glimmering cold. You're literally in the middle of London, that horrible dense fog everywhere, and just these little faint street lights on the street. You almost expect like Jack the Ripper to come tumbling around the corner. I just love
at similar times.
I just love the way it's described there. Obviously, it's more of a poem that you would say about like the effects of war, or even like the effects of war in relationships and stuff. But
even we have that description, but then at the end we also have this quite only a couple of lines, but the idea of home plan jaunts by break and burn, that idea of the countryside representing a type of happiness,
and solace in happier times,
and a nostalgia
from
that
place,
her dead husband feels as he's writing from South Africa.
Absolutely.
I like the fact that even though she's not physically there in the other place, that place and what's happening there does have an impact. What's happening in different places, for example in the soldier as well, does have an impact on people at home. So it's almost like from the soldier you've got that sense of the love of place, and then he dies, and it's kind of almost like you could almost see it as like the after effects of that.
It's almost like Rupert Brooke was the one that wrote the letter.
Well, it's different times, isn't it?
Of course it is,
but it's kind of like that. This is the effect that it would have on somebody left back at home. And we definitely don't get the the sort of rolling hills or anything like that. We get the tawny vapour.
That sort of, again, isolation of the place. Funny how, again, these poems that reference London seem to focus on how not very nice it is.
And then the last one, Afternoons, which I suggested because I think that, again, it's got that sense of place to represent something else. He's looking out over what would have been the time that Larkin was writing a new council estate with a recreation ground, and he's using that to explore the role of women and their relationships in the time. The 60s, often we think of it as a time where there's liberation, but for most people it would have been a very conservative time where people were expected to live up to very stereotypical existence, and I think that by using that place of everything similar, the husbands are in skilled trades, everyone's doing the same job, an estate full of washing. It's the idea that you look out, all the houses are the same, all the houses have washing outside. I think that's represents this kind of the sense of being trapped.
That sense of that real lack of identity, isn't it? Very similar to London.
And even though we wouldn't necessarily put this is a place poem, it's more about relationships. It's kind of hard to, I think, categorize Afternoons, but it does have that description of place, and does have those ideas again. Place
that lack of change comes across in this one as well, doesn't it? The caught in places that are still caught in places, that cyclical nature of relationships and life represented
through the place. So like Miss Weston was saying earlier, that idea of it's not always about how is the place described, it's what is the place used to represent. And I think that representing that monotony of the women's lives that he's exploring in this poem is very much present throughout the description of the place.
And I think also a little bit like we discussed in London, we have this sense of not criticising Larkin. He's empathising but also sneering. The narrator in the poem has this sort of duality of in some things he seems to be kind of really understanding how trapped these women are in their monotonous lives, but then there's that things of like our wedding lying near the television is a little bit sneery, and that their beauty has thickened. You know, it's
so interesting, like, and that's why we love poetry, that sort of
we love poetry.
Exploring those alternative interpretations, and that is what is so important with these things. You have to be able to look at different interpretations. Philip Larkin is no longer alive. You know, we can't literally sit him down and be like, come on Phil, tell us what you're on about.
Although I've heard that there is one monster of an autobiography that Mr Phillips is currently working his way through.
Oh, good on Mr Phillips, because I would not dare.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, as well, if you buy into that kind of the death of the author theory, it doesn't matter what Philip Larkin...
True, it's about our interpretation. And that is, you know, when we talk about our experience as examiners, we can't sit there and be like, that's not what Simon Armitage or Philip Larkin meant by this. Like, no, that's actually a valid interpretation, Mark. You know, so you absolutely can, you know, give these interpretations as long as it is valid and justifiable. Don't be saying that, like...
I think
sensible is the word.
Sensible is the...
And as long as you're not just picking up on a fancy word you've seen on TikTok and shoehorning it in, because that's not analysis. Analysis is thinking about the meaning. You know, me and Mr Steele will both say we would much rather see an in-depth analysis using fairly simple language than trying to shoehorn in, you know, Trinity of Evil, whatever they kept calling
whatever it was. Your analysis can still be band 5, just saying word and phrase and things like that. You know, you can delve into the language without having to label every single thing. And if you did just label every single thing, the examiner's going to sit there and be like, well, you know what language devices are, you know what a verb is, you know what a simile is, but what are you actually saying about them? You're not saying anything about them. So, excellent.
Well,
that seems like
what a lovely place to discuss
a
place.
lovely 1C4 is an absolutely lovely place to discuss place poetry. I will not have any words against it. Thank you. Right, are we going to call it there?
Yeah,
fantastic.
I think so.
Well, I think we should maybe mention the fact that people should watch this space for some exciting things that are coming for the podcast.
Absolutely.
Heavily linked
perhaps
with...
to link to the place of Bradford.
Yeah, linked to the place of Bradford. Yeah, there's some exciting things on the horizon, and hopefully we can talk about them a bit in more depth soon.
Yeah.
Exciting times.
Absolutely.
So enjoy the rest of your week whenever you listen to this, and
goodbye.
Goodbye from us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.